We're on the section now that is the opinion story. Now, the overall, for the remainder of the workshop, I'm going to teach you the concrete system for framing a conversation and then filling in the facts. And until maybe 2 years ago, when I would teach this, I would not have the following section in it. I would just talk about how to, what I call it now, constructive conversation formula, which is that I see as that's a formula where you can frame almost any conversation, no matter how it starts. So a conversation can start with a question or a comment, and it can be positive, negative, or neutral, and it can involve a lot of topics. And when we go into constructive conversation formula, you're going to see there's a way to start the conversation, no matter where they start from, to quickly get it on the right footing. And I found that's very useful. But what I've also found is that there's a certain device that can make your life even easier under certain circumstances, where you can frame an argument and start to fill in facts very quickly. And the key of the situation is the person has to be interested in your opinion. So this is, I want to stress this. We're going to cover the opinion story, and hopefully you really like it. But I'll probably say it again, but this really works when somebody is interested in your opinion. Now, sometimes in conversations, the person is not interested in your opinion, at least not initially. And so just keep that in mind. I think you'll see why that is, but it's such an effective tool that there can be a temptation to overutilize it. So I'll give you how the opinion story works. Actually, I'll give you how I discovered it, and then I'll tell you one of my opinion stories, and then we're going to work on developing at least one opinion story for everyone in here. My opinion story, when I discovered this device, it had to do with my favorite book. Has anyone here ever read the book Atlas Shrugged? Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. I read that when I was 18. Definitely one of the most pro-human books ever written, and I really loved it. And maybe 10 years later, I got the opportunity to sit at the table for the author. Now, she was dead, but for the institute representing her, I got a chance to sit at the table at the Los Angeles Book Fair, which is, I think, the largest book fair in the world. So there's tens of thousands of people, and hundreds of people are coming to the table, and I'm really excited because I want to share my favorite book. And at first, my approach was to tell them that this is the greatest book ever. So I would say, they'd look at the book, and I'd say, hey, you got to read this. This is the greatest book ever. Now, how do you think they respond to that? Prove it, yeah, and I can't prove it in the moment, right?
Why?
What?
Why?
Why? Yeah, if I'm lucky, they'll have curiosity, but they may be resistant, which you are, right?
It was a huge grouping, like you were saying, of tons of different things going on, so it might have not have been as captivated.
Oh, I'm saying if they haven't read it yet. Right. I'm saying they haven't read it yet.
People might not have been as interested.
Oh, yeah.
Because of the huge surroundings of excitement.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah, so I don't know. Their starting context is probably, the last thing they're thinking about is, I want to know what this person thinks the greatest book is. So what I found was, this was an issue I was passionate about, but when I made a statement, when I made a definitive statement for someone who didn't have the context to understand it, which goes to your point of prove it or why, when I made that statement, I got resistance, even though my goal was to generate interest. And this happens a lot in conversation. We make a confident declaration, we want them to say, oh, tell me more. And there's pushback, or they'll try to think of a counter-argument, or like, prove it, or there's no way that's possible, or you must be crazy. And I'm a good learner for these kinds of things, so I tried other things. And later, I would just be more relaxed, and someone would come up, and I'd say, oh, have you ever read that book? And they'd say, oh, no. And I said, oh, it's my favorite book. And then they'd say, oh, why? And I would tell them something I really liked about the book. So I'd say, when I was young, I really liked heroes. Really wanted to do something great with my life, and most of my heroes were in sports. And this was the first book I read where the heroes were like these amazingly cool people who were like entrepreneurs and thinkers, and that really motivated me to go into business and into ideas. It just doesn't matter what the specifics are. Now, how do you think they responded to that? Interest. They say, oh, really? And a much higher percentage chance of being interested. Now, I said it's my favorite book, which kind of means I think it's the best book, right? But why is it less off-putting to say it's my favorite book than to say it's the best book?
Because you're entitled to your own opinion.
I'm entitled to my own opinion.
And you're not like forcing your opinion on them.
I'm not forcing my opinion on them. So I'm respecting their independence. Now, interestingly, they're more likely to agree with me that it's the best book if I say it's my favorite book than if I say it's the best book. Because first of all, they cannot disagree with me. If I just say this is my favorite, they can't disagree unless they think I'm lying. And I'm not saying they have to think it's the best book. I'm just saying I had this experience. I came to an opinion this way, and then the implication is maybe you will too, but you don't have to. So I'm giving them the space, I'm respecting their independence, but I'm creating motivation through the story. And so let's fast forward to fossil fuels. It took me way too long to figure out to do this with energy. But let's say I'm talking to somebody in San Francisco whom I expect to disagree with me. So let's say I ride Uber a lot. I actually don't drive, I just ride Uber. Or sometimes Haley drives me when I'm in Artesia. And so a lot of times I get asked the question, what do you do for a living? Which you'll probably get as well. And just like you, my work is connected to fossil fuels a lot. I have the book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And so if they ask me, what do I do for a living? I'll just say something like the following. And I'll say it differently every time. I don't memorize it, but I have a certain intention. So they'll say, what do you do for a living? I say, oh, I write about energy. And then in San Francisco, they'll always say, oh, renewable energy, I love solar. Right? They always think that I'm like, I said, well, it's interesting because about 10 years ago, I got really interested in energy because it's the industry that powers everything else. And I learned that there are like 3 billion people who don't have it. So I got really interested in the question of like, what's the best energy policy for the future? Is it like, should we be restricting fossil fuels like people say, or would that be harmful itself because we'd be depriving a lot of people of energy? And I was really surprised that I concluded that actually the benefits of using fossil fuels far outweigh the negatives. And that's it. So I don't say that's it, I'm just saying to you that's end of scene. So how do you think they respond to that?
Probably interested.
Okay.
Maybe opening up their mind to a new idea.
Yeah, they usually just say, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, you've not been aggressive.
But notice, I just stated an incredibly controversial position, right? Which is that we should not restrict the use of fossil fuels, that we should continue using fossil fuels. And one thing that I usually do, I should add in the story that I didn't do enough of, so I'll sort of revise the story a little bit. I'll say I got really interested in what's the best source of energy going forward. What I'll usually add is I'll make sure to say the best, what's the best source of energy for human progress going forward, or for human beings, whatever I want to say. And then I'll also say, and like I really wanted to see, I might have said this or not, I forget, but I'll usually say, like, well, if you look at, if you really look carefully at the positives and negatives, what's the best policy? So that, if I didn't say that, like, I almost always do say that. And the reason I do say that is because I want my framework in the story. So the opinion story is a story of is the story of how you reached your opinion. And it works because if somebody asks you if they're interested in your opinion and you tell it as a story, then you can communicate both your framework and your essential facts in a way that is non-confrontational and that respects their independence. So if you tell your opinion story, if you tell the story of how you came to your opinion, you can give your framework and your facts in a way that is non-confrontational and respects their independence and is actually intriguing. Now imagine I said, like I did it a different way, but same idea. And I said, well, you know, they said solar and wind. I say, well, no, actually, you know, I really have a negative opinion of those industries. The energy they produce is unreliable, and I think that the people are ultimately hostile to fossil fuels because they don't actually value human life. And you probably fall into that category. Like that's true. That is what I believe in a certain way. Like it is true that I believe that people are operating with the wrong standard of good, and that causes them to have a lot of bad views. Or even if I just assert like we should use more fossil, like I'm against pro-renewable policies, we should use more fossil fuels, not less. That's a lot for them to take in. And in that moment, they feel like they have to agree or disagree. Now, that's not actually true. I don't think we should feel like that, but that's the way most people feel. Whereas if I tell a story, there's no obligation to agree or disagree. It's usually just, do they want to learn more or not? So what I want everyone here to do is to think about an opinion story, and I want us all to pick the same topic. And I want the topic to be fracking. Okay, fracking, or we can call it shale energy. But what I want you to do is take a few minutes. I'm going to give you some guidelines. But take a few minutes to write out the essential bullet points of how you came to your opinion about fracking. So before I have you do it on your own, let me give you some guidelines. And with each of these, I'll ask for some help. So one part of the opinion story is that part of the story needs to be you being, at one point, you were uncertain about the right answer. So you can't say, I was born knowing this about fracking. But it's important. If somebody tells you, hey, I was thinking about this, I wasn't sure, and then I came to this conclusion, why is that more effective than if they just tell you, I believe this? Particularly if you come from the industry or you're connected to the industry.
Because it shows that you put some interest and some time into researching it.
Yeah, it shows that you put forward effort, which makes you more trusted. Any other thoughts?
I think it makes you seem more open to their opinions.
Yeah, it'll make your overall character looks better if you can be uncertain about something and deliberate. And their default expectation is that you're going to be biased. Or the default expectation of most people is they just inherit their opinion. Another thing that happens is you want to tell a story of a process that you hope the other person replicates. Right? My story is when I tell about, I got really interested in energy for these reasons. I'm hoping they get energy. When I say I was interested in energy, because it's the industry that powers every other industry and 3 billion people don't have it, like I'm hoping that they get interested in it for that reason. And when I say, well, I wanted to look at the pros and cons of the different policies, I want them to look at the pros and cons of the different policies. Because that makes my job so much easier in the rest of the conversation, because I've already shown them a way to think about it. So one thing is uncertain about the right answer. Does anyone here have any want to just share part of their story of like when you first experienced uncertainty about fracking or questions? Okay, well that's a good, I like your example, because then what you can say is you went through a period of ignorance, which is a sort of uncertainty. I mean, you didn't have any, it doesn't seem like you had any kind of moral uncertainty about it, like you thought it was, like you saw Gasland and then you were confused and then you saw something else. But you still could say, like, this is when I encountered the technology, and that's still, like, here's how I experienced it, and then, well, we'll talk about some other elements. But I think it's perfectly good to just talk about your learning process. I think there's something more compelling about that when people just say, oh, well, I've worked in the industry for 30 years, so I know what I'm talking about. Like, it's because they're at least experiencing you as a learner. Anyone else have experienced uncertainty, particularly if you don't have a lot of engineering background in the industry? Yes? But that's so compelling that you took the time, that you had this responsibility and you knew, okay, my decisions are going to have an impact one way or the other. I want to make sure that I have the facts. I think that people often underrate how interesting their own stories are, because if you told someone that, the beginning of that story, and then kind of what you discovered, I think it would be really compelling. Anyone else? Period of uncertainty, yes. Yeah, I think all these are really compelling. One thing I think about when telling it is just the more you can keep it in the first person of your discovery, the better. Because sometimes it can be like, here's how I started, and then this is not at all the extent to what you're doing, but like, oh, here's my lecture now about how the world works. And at a certain point in the conversation, they may want that lecture once they trust you, but you almost can't go wrong with telling it as an opinion story. Now, did anyone notice, listening to this, when I presented you basically all of my views today, most of them are as opinion stories. Certainly when I tell you about moral case for fossil fuels, right? Like, I had this background, I got interested in energy, I got interested from the perspective of philosophy. I found the debate biased, sloppy, and anti-human, so I decided to look at it, from a careful and pro-human perspective. Like, it's very deliberate that I tell it as my journey, and I resisted this for years, because I do not by default think that my personal stories are interesting. Like, I think the facts are interesting, and I think I'm only interesting as a delivery person of the facts, but I found that people take in the facts much better when I tell them about my journey with it, and then they can evaluate that on your own. Because otherwise, it's a little bit weird. It's just like, this guy's talking to us about fossil fuels. Like, where is he coming from? And even people in the industry before I did this, they used to think like, what's going on? There's something suspicious. He can't really believe that. And to me, it was just like, well, it's obvious to me at this point. I'm so clear in my framework that of course I believe it, but they didn't know that. So I had to explain that. Okay, so one thing is, you're uncertain about the right answer. So the starting stage is uncertainty, like uncertainty and concern. And then the next stage is your process, and then is your analysis and conclusion. So let's do the process. So as much as possible, I would encourage you, if it's at all true, when you talk about your process, like the process you went through, talk about, at the very least, looking at all the pros and cons. Even if you didn't think about it that way, you probably had to do it if you had a good process. And if you can really fit in human life or human flourishing, because it's going to make the rest of the conversation so much better. And that's really the way that is the right way to think about any decision, is you have a choice, you have a goal or standard that you determine good choice or bad choice, and then you compare all the alternatives in a fair way. So really, that's what you want to tell the story about. It's like, there was this choice, I was uncertain, it was important, so it's like choice. It was important. Choice, uncertainty, and then standard, comparison, conclusion. Doesn't have to be that way, but that's a good way to do it. So choice, uncertainty, standard, comparison, conclusion. So we've got choice and uncertainty. Let's just talk about process and try to include your standard and comparison if you can. Like we've gotten a couple of stories, but anyone can tell about the process about trying to look at fracking in an unbiased way, or look at the impacts of fracking on human life in an unbiased way. Yes?
I remember when I first started looking into fracking, I do have a history of oil and gas. My family for generations has been involved in oil and gas in some way. And when the movie Gasland came out, I worked at the refinery. My son was very small, and I took him to the Museum of Natural History in Albuquerque, and they were playing that film. And so I watched it with my child, my niece and nephew, along with however many people were in the room with us, and I was appalled at the industry. That's the first time I've ever questioned the oil and gas industry. And because I was a mother. And so I wanted to know, and I read every single article I could find. I read books, I read newspaper articles, I watched anything that I could find to prove to me that the oil and gas industry was doing something wrong. And the more I researched, the more I read, the more I kept coming up with, it's really not. It's not doing those bad things. So I checked into the safety. I could not prove to myself that the industry was doing something wrong. And that's really what I was trying to do. I was trying to validate in my mind that opinion story that was so popular was true, and that I was somehow affiliated with it, and that I needed to get out of the oil and gas industry because it was bad, and it was going to harm my child and ruin the planet and all of those things. But really what ended up happening is I proved to myself that it was safe, it's effective, and it provides more energy for people who possibly might not be able to afford anything else, which was me. I was a single mom. So I worked through a million processes on all different levels, and I still came back to the same thing, and it is okay.
I think that's a really good one. One thought on it is might be even more effective is when you kind of announce your conclusion, like if you say it even more a little bit as your conclusion, because you're saying it like it's safe, and I imagine if I'm listening to it, I might think, oh, well, I'm not sure about that. Versus if it was just, but I love the part about, you read this and you tried to disprove. And everything I could find was that, everything I could find that it was safe and it was, I forget, those words. Just the more it's in terms of you, the more I can just listen to that and I can take in your whole story. Because as soon as you start asserting, okay, this is the absolute truth, then I've jumped out of the story and now I have to take a position right now. But I thought that's a great kind of process. Crack at it. Let's take 5 minutes and just write down your opinion story about fracking. And I think we'll be able to do these even better once we go through constructive conversation formula and see some of the details, but we're getting some really good ones now. So, and then some of you will volunteer, and then we can talk about a couple of them and even refine them. Any questions about opinion stories before you do the exercise? All right, 5 minutes. Oh, sorry, false alarm. I want to just add a couple things because these are just things in the past that have come up. Okay, couple more things. One is that the story should be about you drawing a rational conclusion, not a personal conclusion. It's about your story, but you're discovering something that's universally accessible. So, for instance, your story about reading all of those things, it's a great story because everyone can go through that process themselves. You're just saying, I read this, I looked at this, and I came to this conclusion. Versus if you had said, well, I have worked in the oil and gas industry, and I just knew that my people couldn't do something like that. So that's why I'm pro-fracking. But it's possible to do less obvious versions of that, or sometimes people will say, well, I really like fracking because my father did it and my grandfather did it. Like, nobody cares about your father and your grandfather in this context. We're trying to decide policies that determine the fate of the world. So you only talk about your father and your grandfather insofar as you went through a mental journey that somebody else can relate to. That's an important one. And then another one, this is just from experience of mistakes that are easy to make. Do not compare yourself to the other person. Anyone who's ever been young, which is all of us, does not like it when people say, oh, when I was your age, they're like, oh, I used to think that way when I was younger, right? So do not, they can, part of the independence is they connect it to themselves. You do not connect it to them. You don't say, oh, I was young once and I was an idiot about fracking, and let me tell you the story so that you won't be too. So I'm giving exaggerations, but there's just these subtleties. You have to understand you're communicating a story about a relatable discovery and respecting their independence. Okay, now you can really start. 5 minutes. And you have to be okay with being on camera. Come on, I'll be like Jimmy Fallon. You're afraid? No, I'm a, yeah, let's go. And tell us just about your background in real life, and then do the...
In real life, I'm a pharmacist, so I don't have any personal connection to the oil industry. I have a brother that runs a hot oil service out at Loco Hills, so I get some of that information and understanding from him and from my dad, who kind of started both businesses that me and my brother help him with. So that's basically my background. Not being in the oil and gas industry, kind of not really grown up, but as an adult, when I first heard about fracking, I did not know what it was. And one day I have a high school friend who is a petroleum engineer and works for one of our exploration companies here in town. We were on our way to a college football game. And so I stopped and, well, not stopped, but I was asking him what he knew about fracking, what it was, what it did. So I was just kind of getting all this information out of him. And after I got that type of information, I was asking him about how it affected the environment, what his opinions were, what it did to the rock substructure around the oil zones, that type of thing. And I kind of came to my own conclusion that it really wasn't all that it was kind of cracked up to be, so to speak, in the media. But I also really greatly increased my knowledge just by asking somebody who I felt like was giving me fair answers and not, at least in my opinion, wasn't skewing the information one way or another way. And I've kind of looked up a few things after that just to kind of verify what he was telling me that was true and kind of reinforce my own information about the subject.
What do y'all think? Believable? What do you think? Let's talk about what was effective about it.
Made it very personal.
Made it very personal?
Very open, to make me want to know more about it. I was interested.
Anything else you noticed? They did a couple things that were really effective.
He received affirmation of what he was hearing and indicated that he trusted the person implicitly who he was hearing this conversation. Maybe more about it.
Yeah, so more broadly, he's explaining his process in a way that's relatable, because what he's saying is, I asked a trusted expert, but I did it in a rigorous way, and then he responded in a way that impressed me, which would be very different from my dad told me since I was 2, and so I believe it. And then you said that you looked up other things too. As you were going, I was wondering if that was coming, because if it was just, I asked my friend in a rigorous way, that'd be something, but I, as a listener, would think, well, what about all these other views? Now that I've learned that you process the other views, I'm more open to it. How did you feel telling it?
I felt, I'm not used to being in front of a lot of people, but talking as one-to-one, I think I would be very comfortable doing that. I just kind of feel a little odd, kind of on a stage, so to speak.
Yeah, well, you have great courage.
But I think I could relate that to a group of 1, 2, or 3 people at a time.
Yeah, I thought you did a great job. All right, give him a hand. Next. Who wants to come next? Even if you botch it, I'll be nice. And we'll all learn something.
I wrote down, I'm not going to be able to read my handwriting. A little rushy.
It's okay. What's your name?
My name's Lisa Swint.
Okay.
I recently am now a stay-at-home wife of 3 weeks. But before that, I was a retail manager. So I have no oil in field other than what my husband brings home, because he works in the oil field. So about 5 years ago, my husband and I decided that we needed different adventures in life. So I went into the retail, and he got a job in the oil field. As a concerned wife, he came home and was all excited. Hey, I got hired on a fracking crew. I'm like, what is that? I thought you were going to be drilling holes in the earth, you know, because that's all I knew about the oil field. You went out there, you drilled holes, they did something to it, we got oil. So I went on to, I'm a younger generation, so YouTube was something, and I didn't start with, I just want to know what fracking was. Like what, because I didn't know in my head, you drilled a hole, stuff came out. I didn't know about the process. So going from that, you go to different articles. So I started reading all of these things started coming up on my computer. An explosion happened here, and 5 guys died here. When you think about it though, it had nothing to do with fracking. It was either a made-up story. I learned to debunk those. And I also learned that there are safety measures that they've put in place because it's not something that's new, so that they've refined the process to make it safer for everybody. So that turned out to 5 years later, we're still in the oil field, and I feel safer with him going out there every day, knowing that he's our sole provider.
Great. All right, any thoughts on what worked, what didn't work? One thing on what definitely works, I'm struck, because I've developed the skill over the years. I'm pretty good at like listening as not me, just like, because you, as a writer and speaker, you have to train yourself, because you have to read your own writing as if you're somebody who's not rooting for you to be a good writer, which is a good kind of skill. So I was just noticing, as you said at the beginning, it was so helpful. It put me so much at ease that you had started out with uncertainty. And even though I know that I didn't even remember the method, I just thought, oh yeah, now, like I much more believe this because you had that story. So I thought you told that really well. Anyone else notice anything?
Very credible.
Very credible.
Well, it was nice to have somebody that's younger that their first option was to go to the internet and look up stuff.
Uh-huh.
I mean, that's probably it would be my option now, but it probably wasn't my option just very few years ago, let's put it that way. Yeah. It's still my last one.
You were saying?
Yeah, I really liked what you had to say about safety. Just hearing about that process of getting to safer and safer, I think was very important to say.
There was one part where you slightly broke from it as your story, and I was listening so much after I forgot what it was. Does anyone remember? You were talking about your observations, and it was something to the effect of like, oh, it was obvious that this was, like that something about the explosions were wrong.
She debunked it.
They were false stories.
Right. But there was something where you, like, it's so subtle, but it's like you're telling about your observation, and then you made a universal declaration like, oh, this was totally biased, you know, versus like, this seemed totally biased to me, or I experienced this totally biased. And I just noticed as the listener, I jumped right out, because in my mind, what I thought was, do I agree with that? Like, that's what I asked myself, whereas the rest of your story, I wasn't asking, do I agree with that? So it's this fascinating, subtle thing where when you're telling it and it's just about your observation, I'm like eating it with a spoon. It's just, you know, it's great. And I thought the way you ended was really good too. You know, tying it to yourself and explaining how you experience safety now. So it's just from the beginning, you were concerned, you went through this process, and whether they're in your situation at all, they could go through the process, but then it's connected to you. So it's a great combination of your personal story, but something that's universally relatable. So great job. All right, let's get one or two more.
Shames me into it.
I meant her. She looked like. Okay, great. Yeah, you look like you want to be on stage.
I'm happy to.
No. We want both of you.
No, you go right ahead.
All right, let's go. Tell us just a little bit about your background, and then share your opinion story.
I'm an attorney, oil and gas attorney, but do title work and was president of Roswell Chamber of Commerce a number of years ago when the issue of fracking first came up. And the state legislature, Brian Egoff was chairman of the Energy Committee at the time, and he had commissioned some sort of study and asked for a lot of testimony regarding the issue of fracking in the state of New Mexico. And so trying to represent our business community and trying to educate myself as well as our organization as to the issues, we got involved in trying to learn a little bit about fracking, as New Mexico has a lot of oil and gas production. At that time, Brian Egoff commissioned a hearing in front of the Energy Committee. He called upon, if I recall correctly, a professor from Duke University to
That's my alma mater.
To discuss the perils of fracking and what it could do to communities, what it could do to water supplies, and I think it largely took off on Gasland, that movie that was shown. So we looked at all that. I did attend the hearings in Santa Fe and listen to what was said during those hearings. Listened to professors at New Mexico Tech who were brought in to testify on behalf of the state. And really, on the one hand, you had the Duke professor, and I forget his credentials, but he made some of the claims that were made in Gasland that fracking would cause all these horrendous problems. On the other hand, you had professors from New Mexico Tech, which basically brought it home to New Mexico and showed us why fracking that occurs at 5,000 feet, 10,000 feet, whatever, could not result in some of the problems that the Duke professor was illustrating. And basically said that when they fracture the rock, it's the fractures occur at depth, and those fractures do not go all the way to the surface. In fact, they're lucky to get tens of feet, maybe 100 feet, but they do not come close to even getting close to any freshwater aquifers in New Mexico. And therefore, any fracturing that occurs of a formation is not going to be the conduit for gas infiltrating the freshwater aquifers and causing some of the problems that our community was concerned with. The other things that they indicated was that fracturing of rock had been occurring in New Mexico for 80 or 90 years. And that is how production, particularly in tight formations, is the only way that you can produce oil and gas from the rock that doesn't naturally yield that product. So fracking had been done, maybe a little bit different techniques than what are currently employed, but at the end of the day, the fractures of the rock is fairly limited in scope and does not ever penetrate the freshwater aquifers. So coming back to the community and giving a report, it was our conclusion to our members that this fracturing process would not pose any concerns to our agricultural economic base. It would not pose any problems to fresh water. It would not pose any problems to the health and safety of the people in our community. And so we were very confident that we could take a position as a Chamber of Commerce in supporting our local oil and gas industry, and yet supporting our local agriculture industry and our local businesses, that this was a safe method for us to embrace and not to buy into many of the issues that were being raised through various media outlets that it caused concern. So we were happy to support it, because in New Mexico it means such a great portion of our entire state budget and the funding of schools, and frankly the economic base for our entire community.
Great. Any thought? So let me ask this first. What do you think was the most effective? So that was definitely longer than the others. I'm curious what parts of it you found most effective. What's that? Okay, so that he mentioned that he brought in experts. He brought in experts who disagreed, and then he evaluated them. What else?
The process has been used for a number of years, 80 or 90 years, and has been successful.
So he cited facts that seemed persuasive. Anything else?
Well, I think because he was there on behalf of his community, that he wanted what was best for his community, and came back with the decision after listening to both sides. Appeared to be unbiased going in. But,
Well, and I thought in particular at the end you did a really good job explaining that motivation. I think at the beginning it could have been more personal. Like at the end, it became clear to me, you know, you have a responsibility. You're with the Chamber of Commerce and you're supposed to support industries, but part of it is if one industry is hurting our environment, that is going to hurt maybe that industry, but certainly other industries. So when you made the point about how you have a responsibility to be helpful, but you support agriculture too, that gave me a really clear picture into your uncertainty and motivations. So I would have liked more of that at the beginning. How did you feel about the length? And you can be honest. A little long. So one thing with opinions, does someone else have something to say?
I was going to say typical.
I was going to say, you can tell they bill by the hour.
If you take into account his career profession, it was extremely short.
There you go.
So one thing about the idea of an opinion story is it's a summary of how you discovered your opinion. Remember, what was the one thing I said at the beginning about the context in which you're allowed to use this? There's a very specific circumstance that you can use an opinion story. What's that? Well, that's one part of it, but you're only allowed to use it under a particular circumstance.
if someone's really interested.
If they're interested in your opinion. Now, if someone's interested in your opinion, that's a precious gift that cannot be taken advantage of, right? So it's not a license to lecture. It's, if anything, you want them to want more. So a general in conversation, and I've mostly learned this definitely the hard way, is just that if I can just give them the essentials, and then if they want more, I can tell them. So I found the things I found really compelling were, that I would hit on, were one, just the context of your uncertainty, two, your decision to bring in conflicting experts, three, your observation of like one set of experts gave you a real explanation of how the world worked and had an answer to the other expert, whereas the other expert just made claims that were refuted that he had no answer to. Like, that's a very persuasive thing. If you talk about, I ran into this expert, and here's how they conducted themselves, and then something like, we did further research, and that's how we confidently made this recommendation. So I think the core of it is great. It's just everything is there. It's just a matter of stripping it down so that they say, oh, really? And then they ask you more. And when you get really, when someone says really, then you know that you've done a good job. So thank you very much. All right.
Okay.
Tell us a little bit about your background just before you go into it.
Okay. I'm Amy Barabee, and I actually was going to start out with the fact that I am an Albuquerque kid, born and raised, so drove in for 4 hours this morning, which is to say I live way outside of the oil and gas industry, and had none of it growing up, other than being an Albuquerque kid, taking for granted we're a third of the state's population, so we get a third of the revenues that is a third of the state that Greg mentioned that comes from oil and gas.
Mm-hmm.
So we benefit greatly from it, but know nothing about it, in all honesty.
Got it.
So I came into the oil and gas industry by way of education, and forgive me, it may be a little bit lengthy, hopefully not too much, but I worked in education in the legislature specifically, so grew to understand not just the revenue piece of how much funding comes from the oil and gas taxes to education, but really how much the oil and gas industry does within its community, specifically for education, whether it's scholarships for teachers, scholarships for students, whatever it was. So that was my connection to industry. Through that, I developed relationships with legislators and with the people in these communities, and saw that they were really good people. Well, in working in education committees up in the legislature, and I quickly learned the only thing maybe more controversial and more unpopular than education reform was the oil and gas industry. And that was, I would say to committee members, oh, I love the oil and gas industry in the education committee, and they would just look at me with horror, quite frankly. And so I started to look into what's bad about the oil and gas industry, and asking a lot of questions and listening a lot, and realizing that there may be a space for me, because I care so greatly about our kids and education. All the people I had met in the oil and gas industry shared that care and commitment for me to fit in and figure out a way to learn more about the industry and possibly advocate for it. The way I learned about fracking, my son came home and said, I can't tell my science teacher what you do, and which was curious. And I said, I don't understand. And he said, I can't tell him what industry you work for. And of course I said, well, what are you talking about? He said, well, you're for fracking, and you work for the oil and gas industry. And my science teacher, sorry, it gives me chills when I think about it. My science teacher tells me that that's bad, and that that's hurting all of us. And so we had a conversation about it, and I still learn every single day. I'm still very new to this industry, so I learn every single day a little bit more, but from his perspective to now being in local communities, at local commission meetings, and hearing from people at that perspective, to the legislature, and hearing what people's legitimate fears are, and looking for the facts within that. I, sat down with regulatory experts and listened to them explain to me the 3 layers of casing that has to go between where you're extracting the oil, because they don't want water in the oil any more than you want oil in your water. And so the 3 layers. And so it was a process of learning through that way. I went to the library, I called Jim Townsend, who's sitting back there, very shy. I called him as soon as I was interested in this industry and said, what do I do? And he gave me some people to call who he trusted. So that's how I came about it.
So what's your current opinion?
On fracking?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Sorry, that part I left out. So, you know, as has been said, it's been done for decades. We have never had a groundwater contamination in the state of New Mexico. We are the world's 3rd largest producer of oil. That speaks volumes to me. And in fact, when I was at, it was an event in a county close to Albuquerque, and somebody, you know, an environmentalist came up to me, and I was drinking water, I'm always drinking water, and said, well, would you drink that if it was frack water? And I said, well, not only would I, but having learned about frack water, I would share it with my son and my, you know, whomever. It's, yes, I would, in an industry producing area, the groundwater is completely safe. So what you consider frack water is, yeah.
Got it. Okay, great. Thoughts? What was most effective in what she said?
Concerned about her child.
Yeah. Origin, concerned about her child. Now, did you feel like you needed what came before that? Because I got hooked.
Yeah.
Once you got, son came, like, I'm in the industry, son came home,
Yeah.
like, says it's bad, like, I'm in.
I wanted to go talk to your teacher. I wanted to know
Oh, I
who
went to
it
the
was.
principal the following day, yeah.
Yeah, so it's just one thing that's always interesting to notice as we refine these stories, like what hooks
What the
people.
hooks.
And because that's just it's a very relatable thing, whereas the things about your goals in education, remember the issue on the table is fracking. So if you're telling a story, I want it to get to fracking. So when in the second portion of it, which could just be your start, like you were in fracking in 4 seconds, right? Son came home, said this, it was, okay, great. Now I'm really interested in what you're gonna say. So it's again, they're giving us this amazing opportunity, which doesn't always happen, to share the story of our opinion. And we just have to make sure that every bit of the story reinforces the opinion. Any other thoughts or observations?
The background of Albuquerque was effective.
I studied at North by 40 years, you know.
So you mean earlier on the background about Albuquerque? Yeah, that's true. That's a good point, because I said that the fracking thing. So that, I thought the beginning was too long, but I did think that was very intriguing to me, particularly as an outsider. And I can imagine within the state, it's much more intriguing, because they're expecting, oh, if you work with oil and gas, you just must be one of these locals. So one thing to note is just in our stories, if there's anything about us that might make people think that we're going to have the opposite opinion, that's good. That's why I include usually, you know, I grew up in Chevy Chase, Maryland. Like, I'm not from the industry. I didn't know anyone in the industry. And I gave a talk 2 weeks ago in Midland, and somebody knew about where I was from, and I had forgotten to mention it in the talk, and I probably do 9 times out of 10. And in the Q&A, she said, why don't you tell anyone where you're from? Like, do people know that you live in California? And I had forgotten about it, but it's so interesting to people that I live in California, San Francisco, come from this area. Anything, and I think the reason is because anything that's counterintuitive about our background reinforces our independence. Does that make sense? So anything counterintuitive about our background reinforces our independence. And particularly with this issue, there's always this suspicion of bias. And so the more you can do that, the better. So great job. Thank you.